centralized credential resolver from ServiceNow. My name is Karen Hui, and I'll be helping facilitate today's webinar. Please feel free to type your questions during the webinar. The webinar is recorded, and the recording will be made available after post-processing, usually within 2 days. Our speakers today are Alex Khan, Senior Partner Alliances Manager with HashiCorp, and Steve Emerson, Senior Principal Outbound Product Manager with ServiceNow. Please feel free to reach out directly to speakers via Twitter and for any follow-up questions as well. And please type your questions in the Q&A function below. And now let's get started, Alex.
All right, thank you, Karen. And good morning, good afternoon to everybody. Thank you again for joining us today. And as Karen mentioned, we're here to talk about Vault as a centralized credential resolver in ServiceNow. And so real quickly, I'm a Senior Partner Manager here at HashiCorp, joined today by Steve Emerson, who is a Senior Principal Outbound Product Manager here at ServiceNow. And so today what we're going to discuss and kind of set the agenda. So I'm going to give a brief overview of HashiCorp and HashiCorp Vault. Steve is going to give an overview of the ServiceNow visibility and workflow automation, as well as then do a demo of how Vault will work as a credential resolver, external credential resolver for ServiceNow. So HashiCorp is a leading cloud infrastructure automation company. And really what we've done is our software stack is enabling the provisioning, securing, connecting, and running of apps in the modern cloud environment. And so we have what we call the cloud operating model. And really what this is a philosophy that we have to enable businesses to move into their digital transformation, develop their strategies. And so we have the basis of the cloud operating model is kind of starting with this generational transformation for IT. And so companies are shifting from, a large traditional data center where you have static infrastructure, you have your four walls, you have your firewalls, you have your kind of high trust environment. And now they're starting to move to these cloud environments where you now have a pool of compute capacity, which is going to be available on demand. And so as enterprises are thinking about this, they might start with one provider, but they expand out. You want to really start taking advantage of the scale and speed and the benefits that are provided by these cloud providers in order to be able to deploy your applications and interface with your customers in an easy way. And so now we have what is called the modern data center. So it's dynamic. So you still may have a combination of your private cloud or private data centers where you're running your business databases, internal applications. But now using these public cloud environments, you are using this for your systems engagement. So this is going to be your applications for your customers or maybe your partners. And so you'll end up with this mix of public and private cloud environments. And so as companies are thinking about this migration to the cloud, they're trying to determine upfront how they want to start this journey. Do we want to have a strategy that allows us to adopt any infrastructure? Do we want to be able to think about how we're going to deploy our applications in these new environments? And then also, how do we think about not being locked into a single multi-cloud vendor? And so this is really what that modern data center now looks like. It's this completely flexible and dynamic environment. And this is what we call the foundation of the cloud operating model. And so when we think about this migration to the cloud, HashiCorp has a set of tools that really allows people to address different layers of it. So you go from provisioning to security to connectivity and networking, and then of course, how are you running and deploying your applications? So on the provisioning perspective, we have a product called Terraform, and Terraform is really helping companies moving from that kind of static servers where we're in your old environment now to capacity on demand. And so you start thinking about, well, how do I do my day one operations? So how do I stand up my infrastructure? How do we deal with day two operations of scaling up and scaling down? Day three operations of patching this infrastructure. And Terraform is really allowing companies to be able to do this at scale and also using effectively code. So it's infrastructure as code. Then the next layer is security. So again, we start looking at what does this new modern data center look like and what are the security challenges that we have with it. So again, we talked about before, you had this high trust IP-based security model where you had your four walls, you had your firewall, you knew what was trusted and what wasn't. But now when we move into this environment where you have highly ephemeral infrastructure and very poorly defined network boundaries, well, now you have to move to what is called a low trust identity-based security model. And so you'll hear the expression of zero trust, where you want to trust nothing, authenticate and authorize everything. And this is one of the things that Vault is really focused on, especially for machine-to-machine identity-based access. And we'll talk about this more as part of this webinar. And then quickly, on a networking perspective, again, if you think about what was in the traditional data center, you had static IPs, you knew where your machines were, you had IPs specifically for various services. And now when you move into this dynamic infrastructure, you have to start thinking about your networking in a completely different way. So you start thinking about service-based dynamic IPs. So the idea is that you're going to have a pool of databases and a pool of web servers, and those will be able to connect to each other without having to hard code IPs in there. And the final piece where we really start thinking about is the app lifecycle. So how are we actually managing the deployment of our apps? How are we moving from just having a dedicated application server or a dedicated database server to now being able to deploy our applications potentially across a fleet of infrastructure, across a pool, and being able to do this in a way that our developers are able to do this as well. And this is one of our products called Nomad. And so now to kind of give you a brief overview of the HashiCorp products, we have two integrations with ServiceNow. We have the Terraform one, which is all these are discoverable in the ServiceNow store. And so we have Terraform, and then now the new released Vault Credential Resolver. So let me give a little bit of a deep dive on Vault. So Vault is a tool for tightly controlling access to secrets and encryption keys by authenticating against trusted sources of identity. So a trusted source of identity could be Active Directory, LDAP, could be a cloud identity platform such as AWS and GCP's IAM or Azure AD, or could be a single sign-on provider such as Okta, Ping, etc. And one of the things that Vault is able to do is it enables a fine-grained authorizations of which applications and users can access various secrets. And so we need to define what is a secret. So a secret is anything that you want to tightly control access to. Could be an API key, could be a password, certificate, encryption key, etc. And Vault is providing this unified interface to any of these secrets while providing, again, that tight access control and most importantly, having an audit log as well. And so we get into this nice feature of dynamic secrets. And so what a dynamic secret is where Vault can generate on demand short-term access for various types of systems. So it could be the infrastructure providers, so AWS or GCP, where, for example, you have an EC2 role, or it could be for databases where you have ephemeral database users. And then after creating these secrets, Vault will then attach a lease to them. And once that lease is expired, they can go ahead and revoke that access. And so how this works is we have a model where you have a client. So a client for Vault could either be a machine, human, or an application, and it's going to need to authenticate into Vault. So let's use the web server accessing a database server as your example. So the web server will access, will authenticate into Vault, potentially using one of those cloud identity platforms. Once it's been authenticated, then Vault will say, okay, you now are authorized to do this. Now I can see that you can get a database. So Vault will actually generate an ephemeral database user for that web server and pass that back to the web server via Exchange. Now, the advantage of doing this is, let's say you now have a pool of web servers, is you can now actually create an individual access for each of these individual web servers. And so the reason that this becomes important is you're no longer having to use the same set of static credentials across multiple app servers. So if there's a breach or something happens, then you're not having to revoke all of those individual access points. You can actually go through and look at which web server was compromised, shut down that one without actually taking down the app. So, and the nice thing about this, again, you have that audit log, so you're able to really track and see which server is accessing the database at which time, and if there's anything anything bad happening at that time. So, and again, this is again using that idea of identity and not just talking about is it one service or one IP accessing something else. So something that's pretty important. And so when we start thinking about Vault, there's three primary use cases, and the one that we'll focus on a little bit more for how this works with the credential resolver is around secret management. And secrets management, again, is really this allowing the central storage of all of these secrets in a unified place, so you're not having to spread your secrets across all these different clouds, applications, etc. And just providing that, again, that audit trail. The second use case you see a lot with Vault is where Vault can encrypt and decrypt data without actually storing it. So this is allowing security teams to define encryption parameters, and then developers now can store encrypted data in, let's say, a SQL Server or an S3 bucket without having to design their own encryption methods and not having to become security experts. So they get best practice by design, which again allows for speed of flexibility and access. The third use case that we see a lot of companies adopt Vault is for what we call advanced data protection. So this is where Vault could be acting as an external key management server. So being able to generate and distribute keys and manage the lifecycle. It can also be used for tokenization. So being able to mask data as you present it out to folks. Or the third potential use case is around format preserving encryption. So easy example of this is you have a social security number, you need to leave it in that 9 characters, but you still need to have it encrypted on disk, and Vault is able to actually encrypt that data, send it to there for that long-term storage. And so over the last year, we've seen some pretty amazing growth in terms of the adoption of Vault throughout the enterprise, especially for our commercial version, as well as just the number of people who are downloading the open source. So this time last year, we were at a little over 1 million downloads a month. And over the last year, we've seen about a 300% growth in terms of the number of downloads. So it's something that we're seeing the adoption of Vault really take off. And of course, with this prolific adoption, we're now seeing Vault is being able to do trillions of transactions. So being able to serve secrets, data encryption, et cetera, across to all of the customers. And so with that, I'm going to hand it over to Steve. So I will stop sharing. And as soon as I can find my Zoom window again. And I'll let Steve take over. And he will talk around the visibility and workflow automation.
All right, thanks very much, Alex. And thank you all for being here today. We're excited about this, this integration. And I'm looking forward to telling you more about it. Before we begin, let me just give you guys a quick overview of who ServiceNow is and what we do. So if you think about it in today's modern enterprises, you have all these departments that are using these legacy and siloed systems to get their work done. But that model doesn't really work for cross-functional collaboration. So as a result, employees and customers are becoming very frustrated with manual processes and these long delivery times. Right, and this problem has existed for decades, right? It's not new. So back in 2004, our founder, Fred Luddy, had a vision to build a cloud-based workflow platform that would enable regular people like you and I to effectively route work throughout the enterprise. And I would say that Fred has achieved that vision and then some, right? So fast forward to 2021, and today we are a workflow platform that digitizes and streamlines all the work that flows throughout an organization, right? So gone are the days of you needing to know which specific system to use to process a specific task or make a request to. So ServiceNow seamlessly integrates with your existing systems to provide great experiences for both employees and customers. And as the platform of platforms, as we like to say, ServiceNow is underpinned by one architecture and one data model. So one architecture means that any solutions built on top of ServiceNow across any workflow, whether it's IT workflows, employee workflows, customer workflows, or creator workflows, they can leverage a core set of capabilities. For example, workflow and integrations. That's our bread and butter, of course. We have AI and ML. We have a great user experience across web and across mobile. We have a common security and compliance engine, right? It's a role-based access system. And of course, a centralized admin and configuration model. And then one data model means that all of these solutions can work seamlessly together and leverage that one data repository, right? And for those of you who have been around ServiceNow for a while, that is the CMDB. And that CMDB is what is built on a common service data model. Now, speaking of data model, right, visibility is key for any organization to achieve that operational excellence. And the CMDB is where you gain visibility into all of your operations estate. And that CMDB contains configuration information, as well as relationship information between all of your components. The most successful CMDBs that we see across our customer base are those that are service aware. That essentially means that you are able to understand how a specific component, right, a server or an application, how those relate back to your business. So for example, if you have an IT operations event that is generated against a server, and it's a critical event, right? You've got 20 critical events. If you're able to understand how those events impact the business, you could then help prioritize your response to those events. When it comes to change management, right, and you're planning a change request, you put in a bunch of server names into the change request that you need to patch, right? But how do those servers impact the business? So if you are able to understand that, you could really increase efficiency of the whole process, but also, have a reduced risk because you understand exactly what is being impacted and who you need to talk to get that change, notified. Customer service. ServiceNow is a great customer service solution where customers can, make requests. But if there are systems that your customers are using and they go down, if you have an understanding of how your components impact the customer base, you can better prioritize your response to that. And then finally, right, I'll talk about one more use case here, cloud, right? The big theme of today's webinar is cloud. Right? We need to gain visibility to all of your cloud resources and your microservices so that you can align spend of that to your business initiatives. And your security teams also need to understand who is using your cloud resources, what are they being used for? In the event that there is some kind of security breach or vulnerability, they can reach out to the appropriate teams. So having an understanding of that is critical. And we give you near real-time visibility there. Now, the most effective CMDBs are always populated automatically. Gone are the days of uploading a spreadsheet into a CMDB and calling that accurate. It'll be outdated extremely quickly. So you need to, automate discovery of your environment as much as possible to give you that complete and almost current picture of what your environment looks like. So ServiceNow Discovery can do just that, right? So Alex showcased, that today it's really that mix of on-premise data center as well as your cloud. So ServiceNow discovers your legacy, physical servers. We discover your virtualization environment on-premise. We discover all your modern cloud, resources across, the major cloud providers, as well as serverless microservices computing. And all that data gets populated in the CMDB with information about those systems or attributes, if you will, as well as it automatically creates relationships between those devices. So for example, you may have an application installed on top of a Windows server. That application typically will communicate with a database server. So ServiceNow identifies that, automatically creates the relationship, and also adds that to the CMDB. Now, I'd be remiss if I didn't say how critical or stress how critical your existing systems are to this whole workflow process, this whole cross collaboration. We need to be able to provide a single interface to these systems, and the only way to do that is to integrate to them. But not only do we want to integrate, we want to provide you with the option to, or the capability to automate to all these third-party systems that you have, right? So whether it's granting access to somebody to your sales system, right, Microsoft 365, whether it's standing up a new AWS instance, whether it's granting access to a group in Active Directory, right? Integration and automation are critical things. So ServiceNow provides an out-of-the-box solution called Integration Hub that enables you to do just that. When you think about the complexity of integrations today, the average organization has over 600 on-premise and SaaS applications that are running in their environment. So when you think about the complexity of trying to get these things to work together, it's really difficult and time-consuming to maintain. Right, with Integration Hub, we can create integrations to third-party systems, whether it's on-premise or SaaS, as well as, more importantly, give you the ability to automate workflow to these things from a single place, a central place. So you're probably wondering, well, okay, great, Steve, right? So we talked about discovery, we talked about workflow automation, but where do credentials come into play, and why do we need a HashiCorp Vault? So credentials are critical for both discovery and workflow automation When it comes to discovery, right, we need to be able to query devices and the applications to gather configuration details as well as relationship data. For integrations, in order to integrate to like a SaaS system or a third-party system within your environment, we need a set of of credentials to do that. And then once we've integrated, right, then the next step is creating some sort of workflow execution. In order to execute a command on these systems, you need permissions, right? So if you're going to, let's say, restart a service on a web server as part of an AIOps process, you need credentials to do that. So just a quick reminder, if you guys have any questions, please feel free to use the Q&A panel, and then we'll get to those questions towards the end of this webinar today. So why would we want to use an external credential resolver in ServiceNow? For those of you who know ServiceNow, you know that there is a means of storing static credentials inside of ServiceNow. And I'll talk about some of the challenges that we see across our customer base with that approach. Number one would be credential availability. So in order to for ServiceNow admin teams or ServiceNow platform owners to input the credentials into ServiceNow for those workflow use cases, they need to gather credentials from security teams, from application teams. And quite honestly, they're not always available, right? So having a system that already has them in there to connect to would be a lot easier. Number two would be password staleness. Since these are static credentials, most organizations have some sort of password expiration policy. And if those passwords expire, and ServiceNow is not made aware of those changes, right? Maybe discovery stops working correctly, or maybe workflow automation or an integration stops working correctly. And then third is that we are hearing a lot more organizations that have security policies and regulatory compliance needs that will dictate the need to reduce credential sprawl and to enable centralized auditing. So, ServiceNow is not the only system that would need credentials, right? So, Alex talked about how all these different systems out there, whether it's your cloud or whether it's on-premise solutions, they also need credentials, right? But there's, if you're putting static credentials in these different places, there's no way to centralize the auditing process of all that. So Vault, or HashiCorp Vault, can seamlessly work together with ServiceNow to be a credential resolver. In ServiceNow, there's this concept of the mid server. It is a server that you install on your network, and you install one to many of these things that will connect ServiceNow in the cloud to your specific infrastructure and applications, whether it's in your cloud or in your data center. And that mid server is constantly asking ServiceNow, do you have any work for me to do? It's constantly checking in. And maybe it checks in and says, okay, you have a discovery schedule to run, and you're going to discover this set of IPs, right? But as part of that, we need credentials. So instead of leveraging the credential in ServiceNow, we could point ServiceNow at HashiCorp Vault, and we could then get the credential from there. And then that credential can be used for discovery of your server environment, your databases, and whatever else you have. Now, taking that a step further, here's what the discovery architecture looks like. As you can see there in the center, we have the mid servers, right? So ServiceNow, you set up discovery schedules. The mid server checks in and sees that I have a discovery schedule, right? And it can discover what you see there on the left, which is major cloud providers, VMware, microservices, as well as many different things on the bottom there, right? And then it could use the credentials in the platform, or it could use the external credential store. So this is all part of why we need credentials in ServiceNow, and more importantly, also why we would want to use an external credential resolver. So before I get into the demo, just a quick update on how you would actually install this. So for those of you who are ServiceNow customers, you would go to store.servicenow.com, log into the store, click on this Get button, which would actually essentially make the application available in your instance to install. You would also work with our now support team to request an external credential storage plugin. That's not shown here, but that's also a prerequisite. But then you can go into your instance and go into your applications, do a search for HashiCorp, and then you'll see that the Vault Credential Resolver is available for you to install. You click install, and now it is available in your instance to start using. And we'll switch over to a demo. While I'm doing that, just another reminder, if you guys have any questions, please feel free to jump in. So this is my ServiceNow instance that has the Vault Credential Resolver installed. And it installs an application in the application menu here. I've favorited a couple of items within that application to make this process a little simpler. But the first thing you'll see here is there's an item for Vault documentation. So if you want to get started with this, you could click on this Vault documentation, and you could go to these individual links here to understand how to install the Vault agent, which is an agent that you install locally on the mid server. That agent connects back to Vault application, and it provides better performance since it's locally on the mid server. And next is how you would configure the credential resolver in ServiceNow. First step in that process would be adding a mid server property called mid external credentials Vault address. Since the Vault agent is installed locally on your mid server, it is going to be a local host address with a port of 8200. And once you have done that, just check your mid server jar files to make sure that the HashiCorp Vault installation that you did from the store actually installed this jar file. This jar file is essentially what translates the credential ID in ServiceNow back to a usable credential in Vault. Once you have your setup complete, you could then start to use your credentials. So in ServiceNow, there's a credentials table. You could create as many credentials as you need for different types of scenarios, like Windows credentials, SSH, SNMP, you name it. And here I have a basic Windows credential created. Those of you who are familiar with ServiceNow, you might be used to typing in the username and password. But since we're going to be using an external store, we click this little checkbox here, and we work with our Vault admin. So in this case, I'll say, hey, Alex, can you please provide me the credential ID I need to use for this credential? Alex provides me that credential. I put it in here. I tell it specifically which mid server I want to use. In this case, I've chosen mid Hashi. And I'm going to go ahead and test this credential against a specific IP address and port. Since this is a Windows machine, it's port 135. So it runs a quick credential test. And we see that it is validated. That means that ServiceNow, the mid server has successfully authenticated against that Windows server using a credential from Vault. Okay. The next thing we would do is then use the credential for a specific use case. In this case, I'm going to show you a demo for how we would use it for discovery. Now, I've gone ahead and created a discovery schedule. In your environment, you'll have one-to-many discovery schedules that will discover a range of IP addresses, or maybe it's discovering just one IP address at a time, like this one is. And basically, when you create a discovery schedule, you specify the mid server that you want to use. You could specify this to run at daily if you wanted to, but I've set it to run on demand as purposes of this demo here. Now, as you notice, there's no place in here to actually configure, whether or not to use, HashiCorp Vault. That all kind of happens behind the scenes with that credential that I just created. So I'm going to go ahead and run discovery. And it's going to start a discovery against that one, against that one IP address. anytime you run discovery in ServiceNow, it creates a record in the discovery status table. And as soon as you click Discover Now, you can go ahead and click on the record, and you can take a look at the log to see what's happening. You could look at the queue, which is basically a set of commands or instructions, I should say, that are executing in the mid-server queue. Now, this is going to take roughly 30 seconds to a minute. This is a very slow mid-server that we have here. It's an AWS small, but essentially, once this is finished, you're going to see that we have discovered a Windows device. So I'll refresh it again. We see some more entries in the discovery log. We see that it is now completed. If we go to devices, we can see that this schedule has discovered one CI, and it has created a CI in the class of a Windows server. So that means we were able to log into it, query it, and understand that it was indeed a Windows server. And we went ahead and read its configuration. We added a record to the CMDB. We collected attribute information about that Windows server. And this is just the same thing that would happen if you were using a locally created credential on ServiceNow. So no difference. But with the exception, with the difference here is that we did it through Vault, and we were able to take advantage of the centralized store, right? That could, that could alleviate some of those challenges we talked about earlier. Now, if I look at one more thing, if I go back to that credential, what you'll notice now is that a one credential affinity was created. When ServiceNow goes to run a discovery or use that credential for any purpose whatsoever, you see this order up here, right? You could create an order of credentials to try. Most customers, what they'll do is they'll put their most common credentials, the lowest order number, to try those first. When ServiceNow finds a credential that works for a particular system, it creates a record here for that it knows that this one works. So the next time discovery runs, it'll definitely use this one first. If for any reason this credential gets deleted, or if for any reason it stops working, it'll try the next credential in the order that's a Windows type, and so forth. Then it'll update this table once it's done. So that was a quick demo on how we would use HashiCorp Vault to discover a Windows server, or just run discovery in your environment. The next thing I want to talk about is some other use cases for where how we would use HashiCorp Vault with credentials in ServiceNow. So on the IT workflow automation side, some of the most common use cases that are used by Integration Hub are on the left-hand side here, which is password reset and and account unlocks. So we need to create a credential that has access to Active Directory, that has the right permissions to reset and unlock passwords. Could be on-premise AD, could be Azure AD, or it could be any authentication system that you want. Software requests. So a user could use a ServiceNow service catalog to request a piece of software. That request could then be sent to like an SCCM to actually deploy the software. Access management. This is the most common thing I've seen is maybe creating accounts or putting accounts into groups or assigning roles to accounts. Access to Citrix virtual apps and desktop requests. X instance to X company, meaning if you have a need to integrate two ServiceNow instances together, maybe to exchange incident data, maybe you're working with an MSP, or maybe you just acquired a company and you need to talk, and you need two ServiceNow instances to talk to each other. Once again, credentials are really needed there. Things like SaaS license management. So if you want to be able to manage and optimize your licenses for SaaS, you need to be able to authenticate to the SaaS management consoles to understand usage data, and also pull back licenses. For AI ops, right? We talked about this earlier a little bit, where if you need to, auto remediate a system from from a critical issue, maybe it's restarting a service, maybe it's extending disk space or something like that. And then finally, DevOps, right? Connecting ServiceNow to your DevOps tool chain. Credentials are needed there, but maybe you want to also then integrate it to a, into a deployment system as well. So lots of different use cases as to where credentials are needed in the platform across discovery, across workflow and automation. But really, the key advantage here is, if you use a third-party credential resolver like HashiCorp Vault, you could then take advantage of all the, centralized capabilities, the ephemeral credentials and all the things that Alex talked about. Some useful resources that we put together for you all. You'll get a copy of this deck as well. Both Alex and I have written blogs on this new integration from both the HashiCorp side and the ServiceNow side. We've created a how-to video that goes into much further detail than what we did here today. So please take a look at that if you have any questions about how to install it. HashiCorp Vault app on the ServiceNow store, as well as documentation for both HashiCorp Vault, as well as documentation for the Vault integration on the ServiceNow platform. With that said, we are on to our Q&A section. Do we have any questions?
Thanks, Alex, and thank you, Steve, for a very informative session. So we'd like to open it up for any questions. We have had a few questions come in, but please feel free to type any additional questions in the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen. So the first question that has come in, can I use an external credential store in conjunction with storing credentials in ServiceNow? Who would like to take that one?
I can take that one. So in ServiceNow, you have the ability to create local credentials and also use credential store, right? So you could use them in conjunction with each other. ServiceNow also supports multiple credential resolvers. So if you had two separate ones in your organization, you can connect to that as well. But great flexibility there as far as meeting your needs as far as credentials.
Thanks, Steve. And we've had one additional question. How do I activate the external credential storage plugin in ServiceNow?
Yeah, great question. So it's not obvious in your ServiceNow instance. So you will have to actually submit a request on our Now support, and you will be somebody from Now support will approve that request, and they will deploy the plugin for you. It's not something that is made readily available to every customer, just because we want to make sure that you really need it before you just go ahead and turn it on.
Thanks, Steve. And why would you use Vault Agent versus connecting directly to Vault?
Yeah, so I'll take that one. So we use Vault Agent for a couple of reasons. One is it's actually able to set up secure connections between the mid server and Vault. The agent also helps with performance, so it can cache secrets. So instead of always constantly having to go back to the main Vault server, it's actually able to do this. So you're reducing network traffic, network load on it, and having something that's more local to your mid server. Oftentimes, if we think about that diagram that Steve showed, your deployment mechanism, maybe where your centralized Vault server is in a different environment, and Vault Agent is able to actually bridge that connection. So it makes it a lot easier to be able to get credentials quicker, and in order to enable faster discovery.
Thanks, Alex. And a question from Manoj. Does Vault have an ability to generate dynamic credentials for Windows server access? So I'll take that one. So for dynamic credentials, there are ways to be able to do it. There's certain secrets engines that are available within the credential resolver, and some that are not, that we will be adding support for. I do believe that we have the ability to do dynamic ones for Windows, but we will verify that and double check to make sure I don't lead you down the wrong road. So we'll make sure to make note of this and get back to you on that. Oh, one more question. Is the plugin able to notify admin when the credential expires? So I'll answer part of it. So the idea, and Steve, correct me if I'm wrong on any of this pieces. So that the plugin, reason why you use an external resolver. So if the credentials expire and the discovery fails,
the credential mid server will then actually recontact Vault to say, hey, give me the updated credentials. So it's not a expiry done on the mid server part. There's no tracking of how long those credentials will work. It's more of just Vault being able to do that whenever a credential. So if you're using dynamic ones, for example, this is where that communication will happen a lot more between Vault and Vault, between the mid server and Vault.
Thanks, Alex. I just missed one question here, which was in the chat box. Who would manage the key rotation for server credential?
I'm not sure I completely understand that. So the way that ServiceNow, the mid server and Vault actually communicate is there's an authentication method in there, and that is managed by either a Vault admin in terms of determining how Vault agent is connecting to the mid server. So maybe if that person who asked that that question would be able to clarify a bit. If it's key rotation for like SSH keys or whatnot, then we can double check on that.
It looks like there's quite a bunch of other additional questions. Can Vault perform encryption of data within an application? And can Vault also be used to store encryption keys such as Oracle TDE keys?
Yeah, so Vault can encrypt. Obviously, part of what we have is called the transit secrets engine. So this is that encryption as a service. And so what happens is you do have to make a call from an application to Vault to encrypt or decrypt that data. And then of course you can also store use what we call a key value secrets engine to store encryption keys. So key value can be anything, and it's always sorted. We don't have a direct integration with Oracle TDE today, so it would have to be used via the KB secrets engine.
Thanks, Alex. I think we have time for maybe 2 or 3 more. Let me see. Does Vault work with HSMs, and how is it going to fit in a ServiceNow usage scenario?
So Vault does work with HSMs. In this scenario, the backing of the HSMs doesn't really affect ServiceNow. It's more of the security model. So you can use HSMs with Vault to do either auto and seal. You can also use HSMs to augment the security model of Vault. So for perhaps using what we call seal wrapping. So it's double encrypting some of these secrets engines, as well as entropy augmentation when you're generating encryption keys. But it's more of just how they work together in the bigger picture of HSMs with Vault rather than directly with the credential resolver.
And can we also get the Vault credentials in a script to use for some custom solutions?
Yes, so there are some SDKs out there that we're developing for being able to access credentials in there. Now, the other question now, and I'll hand this over to Steve, is as part of some of those other use cases, can you create scripts that take advantage of those credentials as well?
Yeah, essentially in ServiceNow, you just create a credential record, and the use cases that use credentials don't care where the credential is coming from. So as long as like a use case like integration hub or discovery or anything else that might use credentials, as long as there's a valid credential in the platform, then it doesn't matter. You don't need a script for it. It knows to try the different credentials that are in the platform.
Thank you, Steve. And can I use Vault to store credentials through ServiceNow that would allow an admin to retrieve that credential interactively?
An admin to retrieve. Let's see actually. Yeah.
No, I'm trying to figure out what's being asked there as well. So essentially, you would create the credential ID in Vault, right? You'd give it to ServiceNow, and then ServiceNow would just use it when it needs it. I'm not sure if you're asking if we can get the admin credential password through ServiceNow. I don't think we can do that.
The other way to look at it is, can an admin view the credentials once it's been retrieved from Vault as a credential record? Can an admin view credentials?
No, you cannot review because they're encrypted on the mid server.
I think we have 2 more questions. Did it support MFA?
So both systems independently support MFA. This particular integration between the mid server and Vault, for example, does not support MFA and does not require it, since it's more of machine-to-machine communication rather than humans.
Right. Yeah, you wouldn't want this specific scenario to have to do MFA, because then you would never get your work done in an automated capacity.
We have another longer question from Peter. We've been playing around with a new SN feature called Cloud Native Operations, Kubernetes Discovery. In Cloud Native, we have to supply an SN username and password to the K8 platform Azure. Is it possible for K8 Azure to go to the Vault to retrieve the SN credentials? This is basically the reverse of what the presentation is.
So effectively, and if I'm reading this question correctly, you can use Vault as a credential to store the credentials for configuration. Now, there is no automation built into this, so a person would have to manually retrieve credentials and authenticate and log into Vault to retrieve those credentials. But if I'm reading the question correctly, that's the way that it would work. But it would be a manual process, but you could still store those credentials inside of Vault.
Thanks, Alex. I think we have one last question from Manoj. How frequently is the mid-server agent and Vault talking to each other?
So yeah, I'll let Steve, actually, that's more of the mid-server question.
So yeah, the mid-server talks to Vault when it needs a credential, right? So if we're going to run a discovery or some kind of workflow automation that requires Windows credentials, and the Windows credentials are set to use external credential storage, it'll go there upon request. So the mid server does not cache any credentials that it gets from a credential store, but the Vault agent in and of itself caches it, locally there. But it's not like it's constantly communicating with Vault. It's only as needed.
Thanks, Steve. I think that we've covered all the questions that I can see in our chat and Q&A function. Oh, it looks like there's one more. No, I think we could, thank you to Manoj. And I think that's it. We've covered all the questions. So I think if there are no more, we can thank you, Alex and Steve, for a great session, and thank you to the audience. There are some great questions there. I hope everyone enjoyed today's webinar and has a better understanding of how to use HashiCorp Vault as a centralized credential resolver from ServiceNow. And finally, as mentioned at the beginning, this webinar was recorded and we'll make the recording